The crack of the rifle shot was a sharp, angry sound that ripped through the vast silence of the high plains. It was followed by a chorus of whoops and hollers, the kind that promised violence and cared nothing for the lives they were about to shatter. Jedediah "Jed" Stone, guiding the lead wagon of the small train, didn't need to see the riders cresting the nearby ridge to know what was happening. He'd heard that sound too many times before. It was the sound of the world ending for someone. "Get down," he roared his voice, a gravelly command that cut through the sudden panic. He vaulted from his saddle, his Spencer carbine already in his hand, a fluid motion born of 1,000 similar moments. The settlers, a mix of farmers and merchants, hoping for a new life in Oregon, scrambled for cover behind their wagons, their faces pale with a terror Jed knew all too well. The bandits swept down the slope like a pack of wolves, their horses kicking up plumes of ochre dust. There were 6 of them, a ragged-looking crew, but they moved with the practiced efficiency of men who made their living from fear. Jed dropped to one knee, the carbine stock settling into the familiar hollow of his shoulder. He took a breath, slowed the world down, and squeezed the trigger. The lead rider pitched sideways from his saddle, a silent, tumbling effigy. Another shot from Jed's rifle sent a second man's hat spinning into the air, forcing him to veer off. But they were professionals. They spread out using the terrain for cover, their return fire peppering the sides of the wagons with dull, splintering thuds. Jed worked the Spencer's lever, firing with a cold, methodical precision. He wasn't a lawman anymore, not for a long time, but the instincts remained hardwired into his soul like a brand. He was a guide paid to get these people through the wilderness. That was the promise he'd made. He glanced back, seeing the fear in the settler's eyes, the wide, uncomprehending stare of a child clutching its mother's skirts. A familiar bitter taste filled his mouth. He was good at this. Too good. It was the one part of his old life he'd never been able to leave behind. They were being outflanked. 2 of the riders were circling wide, aiming to come in from behind. Jed swore under his breath and motioned to one of the farmers, a man named Miller, who was fumbling with an old muzzleloader. "Keep their heads down on that side. Don't let them get close." He scrambled over the wagon tongue, the hot sun beating down on his worn leather vest, and moved to counter the flanking maneuver. He found cover behind a rocky outcrop and the stone warm against his back. He waited, listening to the thunder of hooves, the panicked lowing of the oxen. A rider appeared, a silhouette against the blinding sky. Jed fired. The horse screamed and went down, pinning its rider beneath it. That left 4. Too many. The odds were turning the way they always did when you were fighting for something, and the other side was fighting for nothing but plunder. He saw a flash of movement near the lead wagon and realized the leader of the gang was making a direct push. This one was different. He rode with an unnerving calm, his movements precise and economical. He carried 2 Colt revolvers, and he used them with a deadly grace, each shot placed to suppress, to control the space. Jed moved to intercept, but a bullet kicked up dirt near his feet, forcing him to duck back. When he looked again, the leader had dismounted and was dragging the wagon master out from under the driver's seat. He pressed a pistol to the man's temple, his voice cutting cleanly through the chaos. "The box marshal, or your man dies." The word marshal hit Jed like a physical blow. No one had called him that in 8 years. He froze, his blood running cold. How did this man know? The bandit leader's eyes, cold and dark as a winter river, found Jed's across the 50 yards of contested ground. There was no rage in them, no wildness, only a chilling, intelligent focus. He was tall and lean, dressed in a black duster that was surprisingly clean for a man of his profession. "I know who you are, Jedediah Stone," the man said, his voice carrying with an unnatural clarity. "I know what you were. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Jed felt the eyes of the settlers on him. They saw a guide, a hired gun. They didn't know the ghost he was staring at. He slowly lowered his carbine, placing it on the ground. He raised his hands, palms out. "Take the strongbox. Let the man go." The leader smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his gaunt face. Wise choice. He nodded to one of his men, who quickly located the strongbox and hauled it out. But the leader didn't move. His gaze was fixed on Jed, an unsettling intensity in his stare. He pushed the wagon master away and walked forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He stopped a few feet from Jed, his eyes scanning him from head to toe before they settled on the tarnished silver locket that hung around Jed's neck, tucked just inside his shirt. "What's this?" he murmured, more to himself than to Jed. Before Jed could react, the man's hand shot out impossibly fast. He ripped the locket from Jed's neck, the chain snapping with a faint ping. A primal rage, hot and blinding, surged through Jed. He lunged a wordless roar, tearing from his throat, but the butt of the man's Colt caught him squarely on the temple. The world exploded in a flash of white, and Jed collapsed to his knees, the dust tasting of grit and defeat. Through a swimming haze of pain, he watched the man Silas Kane hold the locket in his gloved hand. He clicked it open with his thumb. Inside was a tiny hand-tinted portrait of a woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile. Mary. Kane stared at the portrait for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he snapped the locket shut and slipped it into his pocket with a casual, almost contemptuous air. "A souvenir," he said, his cold eyes meeting Jed's. "To remember our little talk." He turned and mounted his horse, his men falling in behind him with the strongbox. They rode away without a backward glance, leaving behind a trail of dust, a dead man, and a silence that was heavier than the gunfire had been. Jed remained on his knees, the side of his head throbbing, the empty space on his chest, a searing, hollow ache. The silver chain had been a gift from her. The portrait inside was the only one he had. It was all that was left of Mary, of the life that had been stolen from him 8 years ago in a raid that looked chillingly, terrifyingly similar to this one. An unsolved case. A cold trail. A past he had buried in the mountains, a ghost he had tried to outrun. But the past had a long reach. And now it had a name. Silas Kane. Jed stared at the horizon where the riders had disappeared, and a new kind of certainty settled over him. This wasn't over. This was a beginning. A reckoning had just been set in motion, and he would see it through to its bloody, bitter end. The dust of Redemption Gulch was a fine red powder that clung to everything tasting of iron and regret. The sun didn't just shine. It bleached the very color from the clappered buildings, leaving them looking like the skeletal remains of some long-dead beast. A lone hawk circled in the vast, indifferent sky, its shadow a fleeting stain on the cracked earth below. Here, survival was a negotiation, and the desert always had the final say. Ilara Vance understood this better than most. Standing on the porch of her small ranch house, she looked out over the parched fields that had once been her husband's pride. Now they were just another liability, another entry in the ledger that Sheriff Miller kept on behalf of the bank. Since Thomas had died of the fever last winter, everything had become a struggle. The small schoolhouse where she taught the town's children paid just enough to keep food on the table. But it wasn't enough to keep the bank from circling like that hawk in the sky. She ran a hand over the rough-hewn wood of the porch railing, Thomas's last project. He had been a good man, a gentle man with dreams bigger than this valley could hold. Now all she had left of him were splinters and debts. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of 2 riders approaching from the direction of town. She didn't recognize the horses, but she recognized the arrogant slouch of the men in the saddles. They worked for Silas Kane. Kane had arrived in the valley 6 months ago, a man of quiet manners and deep pockets. He'd bought the old silver mine, claiming he would reopen it, and bring prosperity to Redemption Gulch. Instead, he'd brought intimidation and fear. He was buying up land, offering prices that were too low to accept, but too high to ignore for families on the edge of ruin. One by one, her neighbors had sold, packing their wagons and heading west, their faces grim with the knowledge that they'd been forced out. Elara had refused Cain's offer twice. This land was hers. It was all she had left of Thomas. The riders reined in at her fence line, not bothering to dismount. The one in the lead, a hulking man with a mean-looking scar bisecting his eyebrow, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Mornin', ma'am. Mr. Cain sent us to see if you'd reconsidered his generous offer." "My answer is the same as it was last week," Mr. Taggart. Elara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The ranch is not for sale." Taggart chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "That's a shame. A real shame. A place like this? It's a lot for a woman to handle on her own. Things go wrong. Wells dry up. Fences break." He exchanged a look with his partner, a sly, knowing smirk passing between them. "Be a pity if something bad were to happen." The threat hung in the air, as thick and stifling as the midday heat. Elara gripped the railing tighter. "Are you threatening me?" Threatening? Taggart feigned surprise. "No, ma'am. Just making an observation. This is hard country. It's no place to be alone." He tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "You have a good day, Mrs. Vance." They turned their horses and rode off, leaving Elara with a cold knot of dread in her stomach. She watched them go, her gaze following them until they were small specks on the horizon. Then she walked almost in a trance toward the well. Even before she got there, she could smell it, a foul chemical odor that turned her stomach. She peered over the stone lip into the darkness. The water below was murky, coated with a greasy, iridescent film. Floating on the surface was the bloated carcass of a dead coyote. They had poisoned her well. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her resolve. Without clean water, her livestock would die. Her garden would wither. She would be forced to sell. Cain had won. Tears of frustration and fury stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not be broken. Not yet. There had to be another way. That evening, in the dim light of the saloon, she heard the name for the first time: Jedediah Stone. The men at the bar spoke of him in hushed, respectful tones. They said he was the guide who had fought off a half-dozen bandits single-handed a few weeks back, saving a wagon train. They said he was a former U.S. Marshal, a man who had brought law to 3 territories before hanging up his badge. Now he lived like a hermit in a cabin, deep in the foothills, a ghost who only came to town for supplies. They said he was dangerous, haunted, and wanted nothing to do with anyone else's troubles. He was her last hope. The next morning, Elara rode out towards the foothills, a canteen of precious water slung over her shoulder. It took her half the day to find the cabin, a small, solid structure tucked into a grove of aspens by a rushing creek. It was isolated, a place built for solitude. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. A man was outside, splitting wood with a powerful rhythmic swing of an axe. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a low-brimmed hat. As she approached, he stopped his work and turned his hand, resting near the Colt holstered on his hip. His eyes, a pale, startling gray, were cold and watchful. This had to be him. Elara dismounted, her heart pounding. Mr. Stone. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. She took a breath, forcing herself to be bold. Mr. Stone, they say you were the law in 3 territories. My well has been fouled. My stock will die. I need your help, not your silence. Jedediah Stone finished his swing, the axe biting deep into the log with a satisfying thud. He pulled it free and leaned it against the chopping block before turning his full attention to the woman who had disturbed his self-imposed exile. "The law left me a long time ago, ma'am," he said, his voice the rough growl of a man who rarely used it. "So did my appetite for other people's troubles. You're better off finding someone who still believes in badges." He turned back to his work, a clear dismissal. But Alara didn't move. She had come too far to be turned away by a gruff retort. "The sheriff is on Silas Kane's payroll. There is no one else. Kane wants my land. He's driving everyone out of the valley. He sent his men to my ranch. They poisoned my well." The mention of Kane's name made Jed pause his axe halfway through its arc. He lowered it slowly, a flicker of something dark and dangerous in his eyes. He turned to face her again. "Silas Kane. You know him." Jed's face was a mask of stone. "Our paths have crossed." That was an understatement. Kane's face, the feel of his fist against his temple, the agonizing wrench as the locket was torn from his neck, those things were burned into his memory. He had spent the last few weeks trying to find a trail, any hint of where Kane had gone, but the man had vanished like a ghost. And now he was here, in this valley. He looked at Alara Vance. He saw the desperation in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw a core of steel. It was the same resolve he had seen in the faces of settlers who refused to give up, the same stubborn courage that had built this country. It was the same look Mary had given him when he'd told her being a marshal was too dangerous. "Helping you would mean going up against Kane and his whole crew," Jed said, testing her. "It will be dangerous. You could get hurt. Or worse." "I'll be worse off if I do nothing," Alara replied, her chin held high. "I will not be run off my own land, Mr. Stone. I will fight. I don't know how." Jed studied her for a long moment at the silence stretching between them. He had come to these mountains to forget to bury the man he used to be. But Kane had dragged the past back into the light. This wasn't just about a widow's ranch anymore. This was about a stolen locket. This was about Mary. This was a second chance at a justice he had been denied 8 years ago. "The first thing we need is proof," Jed said finally, his voice hard. "Something that ties Kane's men directly to your well. You know anyone who works for him, anyone who might talk." Alara's eyes widened with a flicker of hope. "There's a young man, Billy. He works at Kane's stable. He's always been nervous, frightened. His family has a small farm bordering my property. I think he's only working for Kane because he has to." "Find out where he'll be tonight," Jed said. "We'll pay him a visit." That night, they found Billy closing up the stables on the edge of town. Jed moved like a shadow, cornering the boy, before he even knew they were there. In the dim lantern light, Billy's face was slick with sweat. "We know you were one of the men who rode out to Mrs. Vance's ranch yesterday." Jed said, his voice low and calm, but carrying an unmistakable threat. "We just want you to tell the sheriff what you were ordered to do." Billy trembled, looking from Jed to Alara and back again. I can't." Taggart. "He said they'd burn my family out if I ever said a word." "Mr. Kane, you don't know what he's capable of." "I have an idea," Jed said grimly. "But he can't hurt you if he's behind bars. You do the right thing, son. Testify. I'll make sure you and your family are protected." A flicker of courage appeared in the boy's eyes. He nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "All right, I'll do it." The next morning, as they rode into town to meet Billy at the sheriff's office, they saw the small crowd gathered by the blacksmith's forge. Sheriff Miller was standing over a body covered by a dusty blanket. He pulled the blanket back. It was Billy. His face was bruised and broken. "Looks like his horse threw him," the sheriff announced to the onlookers, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Terrible accident." He looked directly at Jed and Alara, a cold warning glint in his eyes. "This is wild country. Accidents happen all the time." The message was clear. Kane owned the law in Redemption Gulch. The witness was silenced. Their first attempt had failed, and now a boy was dead. Alara swayed her face ashen. Jed put a steadying hand on her arm. This was his fault. He had pushed the boy, promised him protection he couldn't provide. The weight of his failure settled on him, heavy and familiar. He looked past the sheriff toward the imposing office of the Kane Mining Company at the end of the street. Kane wasn't just a land grabber. He was a killer who ruled this town through fear. And Jed had just made it personal. "This changes things," Jed said to Alara, his voice a low growl. "This isn't about your ranch anymore. This is about taking this town back." He looked at her, saw the fear in her eyes warring with her resolve. "But we do it my way now. No more witnesses. No more talking. Kane only understands one language. It's time we started speaking it." The days that followed fell into a new, dangerous rhythm. Jed moved into Alara's barn, a silent guardian, whose presence was a comfort and a constant reminder of the stakes. The ranch became a fortress. He taught her how to use the rifle Thomas had left behind, a heavy Winchester that felt awkward and alien in her hands. "You're pulling the trigger, not squeezing it," he'd say, his voice patient as he adjusted her stance. His hands were rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he positioned her arms. "Breathe out. Become part of the rifle. Don't fight it." Slowly, she learned. The jarring kick became manageable. The distant tin can she was aiming at began to dance with satisfying regularity. In these moments, standing close to him in the quiet of the high desert, she saw past the gruff exterior. She saw the weariness in his eyes and the deep lines of sorrow etched around his mouth. He was a man carrying a heavy burden, and she found herself wanting to understand what it was. By night, they planned. Jed, with his lawman's mind, began to piece together Kane's strategy. "He's not just grabbing land at random," he said one evening, sketching a map of the valley on a piece of parchment. "Look at the parcels he's bought. They all follow the line of Dry Creek." "But Dry Creek only runs for a month or two after the spring thaw," Alara said, confused. "Exactly. So why does he want it?" The answer came from Gus, an old grizzled prospector who lived a hermit's life, even more isolated than Jed's. Jed sought him out one afternoon, finding him panning for color in a mountain stream. Gus had been in the valley for 40 years and knew its secrets better than anyone. Silas Kane. Gus spat, his rheumy eyes narrowing. "Poison. That one's poison in a fancy suit. He ain't after land, Jed. He's after what's under it." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's an underground river that follows the path of Dry Creek. An aquifer. Only a few of us old-timers know about it. It's the only reliable water source for 50 miles in any direction." The pieces clicked into place. The railroad, Jed said, the realization dawning on him. They're surveying a new route through this pass. They'll need a water stop for the steam engines. And whoever controls the water controls the railroad. Gus finished nodding. They'll pay a king's ransom for it. Kane's not trying to run a ranch. He's trying to build an empire. The knowledge made their fight seem even more hopeless. They weren't just up against a bully. They were up against a man with a grand, ruthless vision. As Jed rode back to the ranch, the weight of his own past pressed in on him. He kept seeing flashes of the raid that took Mary. the precision of the attack, the cold-blooded efficiency. It wasn't the work of common bandits. It was organized. It was professional. Just like Kane's operation here. He'd see Kane's face in his dreams, watching him open the locket, his expression unreadable. Why had he taken it? Was it just a random act of cruelty, or was there something more? The questions gnawed at him, twisting the fight for Alara's land into something deeper, something intensely personal. He was no longer just helping a woman in need. He was hunting a ghost from his own past, and he was beginning to suspect that ghost had a very real, very dangerous agenda. They needed to disrupt Kane's operation, to hit him where it hurt. Gus had mentioned that Kane's supply wagons ran a regular route from the railhead, bringing in mining equipment and, more importantly, payroll for his hired guns. A man who can't pay his men is a man who can't trust them. Jed explained to Alara as they watched the dusty trail from a high, rocky vantage point. We hit his supply line. We take the payroll. We make him bleed. It was a reckless plan, and Alara knew it. But she also knew it was necessary. She trusted Jed. In the weeks they had spent together, she had seen the man behind the legend, a man of quiet honor, haunted by a past he refused to speak of, but driven by a deep, unshakable sense of justice. They chose their spot carefully, a narrow pass where the trail wound between towering rock formations. Jed blocked the path with a fallen pine tree, while Alara took up a position with the Winchester on a ledge overlooking the road. Her job was to provide covering fire to keep the outriders busy. Jed would handle the wagon itself. The rumble of the heavy wagon reached them before they saw it. 2 outriders led the way, followed by the wagon driven by Taggart himself. Another 2 riders brought up the rear. 5 of them. The odds were long. "Remember what I taught you," Jed said, giving her shoulder a brief squeeze. "Don't think, just aim." He disappeared into the rocks below. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. There was no turning back. As the lead riders approached the roadblock, they slowed, suspicion dawning on their faces. That was the signal. Alara took a deep breath, lined up her sights on the rear rider, as Jed had instructed, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the man toppled from his horse. The canyon exploded into chaos. Gunfire echoed off the rock walls. Alara worked the Winchester's lever, her movements clumsy with adrenaline, but effective enough. She fired again, splintering the rock near a second rider, forcing him to take cover. Below, Jed erupted from his hiding place. He shot the driver of the lead pair's horse, sending the animal and rider crashing to the ground. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was terrifying to behold, a whirlwind of calculated violence. He took down another rider before Taggart, and the last man could even bring their guns to bear. Taggart roared in anger and charged, firing his revolver wildly. But Jed was already moving, using the wagon for cover. He appeared on the other side, his own Colt bucking in his hand. Taggart cried out and clutched his shoulder, his pistol falling into the dust. The last man, seeing he was beaten, threw down his gun and raised his hands. Jed disarmed Taggart, his face grim. He turned his attention to the other man, a younger crony with shifty eyes, whom Jed recognized as one of Kane's lieutenants. "Where's the payroll?" Jed demanded. In the strongbox under the seat, the man stammered, his eyes wide with fear. As Jed hauled the heavy box out, Taggart made a desperate move. Groaning in pain, he lunged for his fallen pistol. Jed spun, his movements a blur, and kicked the gun away. He shoved Taggart back against the wagon wheel, the big man slumping to the ground. In the scuffle, something small and metallic fell from the lieutenant's vest pocket, landing in the dust with a soft clink. Jed froze. The sunlight glinted off tarnished silver. It was a locket. His locket. Time seemed to stop. The sounds of the canyon, the wind, the nervous panting of the horses, Alara scrambling down from the ridge, faded into a dull roar in his ears. He bent down and picked it up, his hand, trembling. He didn't need to open it. He knew the weight of it, the feel of the worn engraving of a single rose on its surface. Mary's favorite flower. He straightened up the locket clutched in his fist and turned to face the lieutenant. The man's face went pale, a look of pure terror dawning in his eyes. Jed's own face was a storm cloud of gathering fury. The weariness was gone, replaced by a cold, lethal rage. "Where did you get this?" Jed's voice was barely a whisper, but it was more menacing than any shout. I found it," the man stuttered. Jed grabbed him by the front of his shirt, lifting him effortlessly onto his toes. He pressed the barrel of his Colt under the man's chin. "You have one chance to tell me the truth." The man broke. Tears streamed down his face. "Kane gave it to me after the raid on the stagecoach. He said it was a bonus." The words hit Jed with the force of a physical blow. Kane. Not only had he stolen it, he had given it away like some cheap trinket. A bonus. The last piece of his wife's memory treated as plunder. But a darker question formed in Jed's mind, a suspicion that had been festering for weeks. The raid on the stagecoach. Was that the first time you rode with him? The man was sobbing now, incoherent with fear. No. I've been with him for years. Since the old days. Back in the Cimarron territory. Cimarron territory. 8 years ago. The world narrowed to a single point. The settler wagon Jed breathed the words tasting like ash. The one hit outside of Willow Creek. The one where they killed the marshal's wife. The lieutenant's eyes widened in horrified recognition. He knew. He led that raid, the man confessed, his voice cracking. It was Kane. It was always Kane. The twist of the knife was absolute. The fight for Alara's land, the battle for Redemption Gulch, it had all been a prelude. A cosmic accident that had led him back to the man who had destroyed his life. Silas Kane was not just a ruthless land baron. He was the architect of Jed's personal hell, the ghost who had haunted his every waking moment for 8 long years. Jed released the man, who collapsed into a whimpering heap. Jed stood over him, the silver locket cold against his palm, his face a mask of terrible newfound purpose. This was no longer about justice. It was about vengeance. And Jedediah Stone would burn the world down to get it. The rage was a fire in his blood, burning away the cautious, weary man he had become, and leaving behind the relentless hunter he once was. The reclusive guide was gone, replaced by U.S. Marshal Jedediah Stone. Only this time, he wasn't serving the law. He was serving a ghost. He was serving Mary. Back at the ranch, he was a different person. The quiet patience was gone, replaced by a tense, focused energy that frightened Alara. He barely spoke, spending his hours cleaning his weapons, studying his map of the valley, and staring out at the distant silhouette of Kane's mine with an unnerving intensity. "We have the payroll," Alara said, trying to reach him. "We can use it to hire men to fight back." "I don't need men." Jed snarled, his eyes glinting in the lantern light. "I just need Kane." He began to lay out his plan, and it was nothing short of a suicide mission. A direct assault on Kane's fortified ranch, a sprawling compound that served as the heart of his operation. "He has a dozen men there, maybe more," Jed said, tracing a line on the map with the tip of his knife. "I'll go in at night. Create a diversion here," he pointed, "and then go straight for the main house. Straight for him. You'll be killed before you get within 100 yards. Alara protested, her voice tight with fear. "This isn't a plan, Jed. It's a death wish. It's the only plan that matters." He shot back, his voice raw with a pain she was only just beginning to understand. He finally told her everything. About Mary, about the raid 8 years ago, about the locket, and about the crushing guilt he had carried ever since. He had been away tracking another outlaw when it happened. He had left her alone, unprotected. His vengeance won't bring her back, Alara said softly, her heart aching for him. And it won't save this town. Don't you see? If you do this, you become just like him. A killer driven by hate. Is that what she would have wanted? Her words hit him a small crack in the armor of his rage. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time in days, and saw not just a partner in a fight, but a woman who had come to care for him, a woman who was trying to pull him back from the abyss. She was his moral compass, the last anchor to the man he was before the fire consumed him. But before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses shattered the night. Cain had found them. They looked out the window to see a dozen riders surrounding the house, torches held high, casting flickering demonic shadows. Taggart was with them, his arm in a sling, his face twisted with malice. But Cain was not. This wasn't an attack. It was a message. Jedediah Stone. Taggart's voice boomed across the yard. Mr. Cain knows you have something of his, and now he has something of yours. He invites you to make a trade. Two of the riders parted, revealing Silas Cain on horseback. And slumped in front of him, bound and gagged, was Alara. He must have circled around and taken her from the back of the house while Taggart created the diversion. The trap had been sprung with chilling precision. Cain looked directly at the house, a faint, triumphant smile on his lips. The old silver mine at Dawn Marshall, he called out, his voice calm and clear. Bring my money. Come alone. Or the schoolteacher pays for your mistakes. Just like your wife did. He turned his horse and rode off into the darkness, his men following close behind. They left Jed alone, the echo of Cain's threat hanging in the silent night. He had been so consumed by his own quest for vengeance that he had let his guard down. He had put Alara in danger. The same mistake. He had failed to protect another woman he cared about. The realization was a cold, sharp knife in his gut. The choice was no longer his. Cain had forced his hand, setting the stage for their final confrontation on his own terms. Jed looked at the payroll money stacked on the table, then at the locket clutched in his hand. He had to save Alara. But to do that, he had to master the demon inside him. He had to choose between the raw vengeance he craved and the justice Alara deserved. As the first gray light of dawn touched the sky, a storm was brewing in the west. The air was thick and heavy, charged with electricity. Jed rode towards the abandoned silver mine, the heavy saddlebags filled with Cain's money slung over his horse. The wind whipped at his duster, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. It was a fitting day for a reckoning. The mine entrance was a gaping black maw in the side of the mountain. He dismounted, taking his carbine and a lantern. The deal was a lie. He knew that. Cain would never let them both walk away. He entered the mine, the darkness swallowing him whole. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet rock and decay. The lantern cast a small flickering circle of light, revealing rotting support beams and dark branching tunnels that disappeared into nothingness. Water dripped from the ceiling, the sound echoing like a ticking clock in the oppressive silence. Cain Jed's voice bounced off the walls, distorted and strange. I'm here, I have your money. A voice answered from deep within the mine, smooth and mocking. A little further, Marshal. I want to be sure you came alone. Jed walked deeper into the earth, his boots crunching on loose gravel. The tunnel opened into a large cavern where a central shaft plunged into blackness. Ilara was there, tied to a thick support beam. Silas Kane stood beside her, a revolver in his hand, a smug look on his face. Taggart and two other men stood in the shadows, rifles ready. "The money," Kane said, gesturing with his pistol. "Toss it over." Jed unslung the heavy bags and threw them onto the cavern floor. As Taggart moved to retrieve them, lightning flashed outside, illuminating the mine entrance for a split second. In that brief flash, Jed saw the glint of metal. Gus. The old prospector was hidden in the rocks outside, rifle in hand. He had followed him. They were not alone. It was the advantage Jed needed. He met Gus's eyes for a fraction of a second, and a silent understanding passed between them. "Now let her go," Jed said, his gaze locked on Kane. Kane chuckled. "I don't think so. You see, this has become so much more than a land dispute. It's become a reunion. I've thought about you for a long time, Marshal. Wondered what became of the man who took everything from me." Before Jed could process the words, a rifle shot thundered from the mine entrance. One of Kane's men cried out and fell. Gus had made his move. The cavern erupted into a hell of noise and muzzle flashes. Taggart spun towards the entrance, firing wildly. Jed dove for cover behind a stack of old mining carts, his Colt already in his hand. He fired twice, and the second of Kane's men crumpled to the ground. A clap of thunder louder than any gunshot shook the very mountain. The ground trembled, and loose rock rained down from the cavern's ceiling. The old mine was unstable. Kane, seeing his plan unraveling, grabbed Ilara and began dragging her towards a deeper tunnel, using her as a human shield. "It's just you and me now, Marshal," he screamed over the din. Jed took off after them, plunging deeper into the suffocating darkness of the mine. The chase was a desperate, stumbling affair through narrow, winding tunnels. The lantern light bobbed and weaved, casting frantic shadows that seemed to claw at them from the walls. The mine groaned around them, the storm outside, and the gunfight inside, threatening to bring the whole mountain down on their heads. He finally cornered Kane in a dead-end shaft. It was just the two of them, their harsh breathing echoing in the confined space. Kane shoved Ilara against the wall and turned to face Jed, his face a mask of furious hatred. "Why," Jed demanded, his pistol leveled. "Why, Mary, she had nothing to do with you." "She had everything to do with you." Kane screamed, his voice cracking with a mad grief. "My brother Thomas, a boy of 17. He fell in with a bad crowd, robbed a general store. You arrested him. You sent him to that hellhole of a prison in Yuma. He died of fever in the first 6 months, Marshal. Neglect. You were responsible for that prison. You took my family, so I took yours, an eye for an eye, Marshal." The revelation struck Jed with the force of a physical blow. Thomas Kane. He remembered the name, remembered the boy's terrified face. He had been a casualty of a brutal system, a system Jed had once served without question. In that moment, he saw the tragic, twisted parallel between them. Two men hollowed out by loss, driven by ghosts. Kane's evil was not excused, but it was explained. It was born from a pain Jed understood all too well. Another tremor shook the tunnel. The support beams above them groaned, splintering under the strain. Dust and pebbles rained down. The whole tunnel was about to collapse. Kane saw his chance. He lunged at Jed not with his gun, but with a raw, desperate fury. They crashed against the rocky wall, a tangle of limbs and hatred. The fight was brutal, primal. It wasn't about skill anymore, it was about will. They rolled on the ground, trading blows, the pistols forgotten. Jed was stronger, but Kane was fueled by years of festering rage. He managed to get his hands on a loose rock and brought it down hard on Jed's side. Pain flared through Jed's ribs, but he gritted his teeth and drove his elbow into Kane's face. He got the upper hand, pinning Cain to the ground, his hands around the other man's throat. He could end it. Right here. He could squeeze the life out of the man who had caused him so much pain. Vengeance was an inch away. He saw Mary's face, heard Alara's words. You become just like him. With a guttural roar of effort, Jed pulled back. He would not become a murderer. Not for Cain. Not for anyone. He hauled the dazed man to his feet, just as the main support beam snapped. Run, he yelled at Alara. He shoved Cain ahead of him and pushed Alara towards the exit, turning to shield them with his own body as the roof of the tunnel began to collapse. Rocks and timbers rained down, and the world went black. Jed came to with the taste of dust in his mouth and Alara's hand on his face. He was lying just outside the collapsed tunnel, his body a map of aches and bruises. Gus was there, his old face etched with concern. A few feet away, a wounded but living Silas Cain was being tied up by Taggart, who had surrendered the moment Gus got the drop on him. Jed had chosen justice. He had dragged Cain from the collapsing mine, saving the life of the man he hated most in the world. As they emerged into the gray, rain-soaked morning, the storm outside having finally broken, Jed knew he had broken a storm inside himself as well. He brought Cain back to Redemption Gulch. The townspeople who had lived in fear for so long came out of their homes. They saw their oppressor beaten and bound. They saw Alara safe. And they saw Jedediah Stone not as a mythical lawman or a haunted recluse, but as the man who had given them their town back. A quiet, determined cheer went up from the small crowd. Just then, two riders appeared on the main road. They were federal marshals. Gus, ever the prudent one, had ridden for the nearest territorial office days ago, convinced that Jed would need official help to finish the job. They took Cain and his men into custody, their presence making the victory final and legal. The reign of Silas Cain was officially over. Jed and Alara stood together in the cleansing rain, watching them go. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. It was dented and scratched from the fight, but it was whole. He clicked it open and looked at Mary's smiling face. The agonizing grief was still there, but for the first time in 8 years, it wasn't accompanied by the burning fire of rage. It was just sorrow. A clean, quiet sorrow he could learn to live with. Weeks later, a fragile peace had settled over the valley. The dust of Redemption Gulch seemed less like regret and more like fertile soil. With Cain's empire dismantled and the payroll he'd stolen distributed back to the ranchers he'd cheated, the town was beginning to rebuild. Alara's ranch was secure, the title free and clear. The poisoned well had been cleaned and the water ran pure again. Jed received a letter forwarded by the Marshal's Service. It was a formal notice confirming Silas Cain's conviction on multiple counts of murder, robbery, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to hang. Justice had been served. He took the letter and the recovered silver locket and rode out to the quiet, windswept hill where he had buried Mary all those years ago. He knelt by the simple wooden headstone, the grass around it green from the recent rains. He placed the locket on the marker, the silver glinting in the afternoon sun. He didn't need to carry her memory around his neck anymore. He carried it in his heart. Rest now, Mary, he said, his voice clear of its old burdens. The wind seemed to whisper a reply through the tall grass. For the first time, he felt a sense of closure, of peace. The past was no longer a ghost to be hunted or outrun. It was simply a part of him, a part he could finally lay to rest. He rode away from the grave, not toward his isolated cabin in the mountains, but toward the warm, welcoming light of Alara's ranch. He found her on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. She smiled as he approached. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "I think so," he said, dismounting. Before he could say more, a buckboard rattled up the road. In it were the mayor of Redemption Gulch and the visiting territorial judge. They had come with an offer. The town needed a new sheriff, someone who couldn't be bought, someone who believed in the law. They were offering the position to him, a permanent position. Jed looked at the tin star the judge held out to him. For years that star had been a symbol of everything. He had lost a burden he could no longer carry. But now it looked different. He looked at Alara, saw the hope and trust in her eyes. She gave a small, encouraging nod. He took the badge. It felt solid and real in his palm. Not a weight from his past, but a promise for their shared future. The story concludes with Jed and Alara standing on her porch, looking out over the valley as twilight settled. The land was peaceful, the town was safe, and their hands found each other naturally, their fingers intertwining. The hawk was gone from the sky, and in its place the first stars of evening began to appear bright and clear. Jedediah Stone was no longer a ghost haunted by yesterday. He was a man ready to build a tomorrow with a town to protect and a woman to stand beside him. True justice, he was beginning to understand, wasn't about avenging the past. It was about having the courage to build a future